The first time Adrian Thornhill saw the orc woman haul a cord of split firewood up his frozen mountain path without breaking a sweat, he decided she was either the most practical creature he had ever met or secretly fond of showing off, and he spent the next 3 winters trying to figure out which. She arrived every year when the first heavy snows locked the high country in white silence, her sledge piled with seasoned oak and hickory, her shoulders broad beneath a wool cloak that had seen better decades. Adrian always bought enough to last until spring because he valued warmth over coin, and because watching her stack wood with the efficiency of someone who had done it 1,000 times gave him something to look forward to in the bleak months. She never stayed long, never accepted tea, never said more than was necessary to conduct business, but her voice when she spoke was low and clear, and her eyes were the color of amber held up to firelight. Adrian was not a man given to flights of fancy, but he was honest enough to admit when something interested him, and the orc woman interested him more with every passing season. He had come to the mountain 5 years ago, a surveyor by training who had grown weary of laying roads for men who cared nothing for the land they carved through. His cottage sat in a high valley where the pine forests met the rocky slopes, far enough from the nearest village that visitors were rare and solitude was reliable. He had books, a decent store of supplies, and enough skill with a pen to take occasional commissions mapping property lines for homesteaders who needed legal claims drawn up. It was a quiet life, and he had chosen it deliberately after years of noise and crowds and the constant press of people who wanted things from him. But quiet did not mean he had forgotten how to talk, and when the orc woman came each winter, he found himself deploying every scrap of charm and wit he possessed just to coax a few extra words from her. "Back again," he said the first time she arrived that 4th winter, stepping out onto his porch as her sledge crunched to a halt in the yard. "I was starting to worry you had found more interesting customers." She glanced up at him, her green face unreadable beneath the hood of her cloak. "You pay fair and you do not waste my time. That makes you interesting enough." "High praise," Adrian said, grinning. "I shall have it engraved on my headstone." She snorted softly, a sound that might have been amusement, and began unstacking the wood with practiced efficiency. Adrian came down to help, as he always did, though she never seemed to need it. Up close, he could see the small tusks that curved up from her lower jaw, the pointed tips just visible when she spoke, and the way her breath misted in the freezing air. She was not tall by orc standards, he guessed, perhaps only a few inches above his own 5 feet and 10 inches, but she was built solid and strong, with a breadth to her shoulders and hips that spoke of hard work and good health. Her hands were scarred and calloused, and she moved with the grace of someone completely at ease in her own skin. "Bad winter coming," she said as they stacked the wood against the side of his cottage. "You will want extra." "You say that every year," Adrian replied, setting a log in place. "And every year I end up with enough to build a second house. Then you do not freeze." She straightened, brushing bark dust from her gloves. "That is the point." He could not argue with that. "What do I owe you?" She named a price that was fair to the point of generosity, and he paid it without haggling, adding a little extra as he always did. She frowned at the coins in her palm. "This is too much." "Consider it a tip for hauling all this up the mountain," Adrian said. "I know it is not an easy climb. I have made harder climbs for less pay." But she pocketed the coins and turned back to her sledge. For a moment, Adrian thought she would leave without another word, as she had done every year before, and something in him rebelled at the thought. 3 winters of brief exchanges and polite transactions, and he still knew almost nothing about her except that she lived somewhere deeper in the forest and kept to herself. It seemed a waste, somehow, and loneliness did strange things to a man's sense of caution. "Why do you live alone?" he asked before he could think better of it. She stopped, one hand on the sledge rope, and turned to look at him. Her amber eyes were startling in the pale winter light. "Why do you?" I asked first, Adrian said, trying to keep his tone light. "And I am a paying customer, so I think I deserve at least one honest answer." For a long moment she said nothing, and he thought he had overstepped, that she would simply walk away and perhaps not come back next winter. But then she tilted her head slightly, regarding him with something that might have been curiosity. "You really want to know?" "I do," he said, and realized as he spoke that it was true. He did want to know. He wanted to know why a woman who could stack a winter's worth of firewood without complaint and navigate frozen mountain paths in the dark chose to live apart from everyone, orc and human alike. He wanted to know what she did with her days, where she went when she left his doorstep, whether she ever got lonely in the deep woods when the snow piled high and the nights stretched long. She studied him a moment longer, then gave a slight nod. "I live alone because someone needs to watch the old forest," she said, "and there is no one left but me." It was not the answer he had expected, and it raised more questions than it answered. But before he could ask any of them, she had turned away and started down the path, her sledge rattling behind her in the snow. Adrian watched until she disappeared into the trees, then went back inside to his fire and his books, and tried not to think about amber eyes and the sadness he had heard beneath her words. But he did think about it, all through the long weeks of deep winter when the snow fell thick and the wind howled down from the peaks. He thought about it when he sat by his fire at night, and when he tramped through the drifts to check his traps, and when he woke in the dark hours before dawn and listened to the silence of the frozen world outside. Someone needs to watch the old forest. What did that mean? Watch it from what? And why was she alone in the task? He was still thinking about it when she came again 6 weeks later, her sledge loaded with another delivery, though he had not expected her so soon. "I did not order more wood," he said, stepping out to meet her. "No," she agreed, "but you will want it anyway. Big storm coming. 3 days, maybe 4. Adrian glanced at the sky, which was cold and clear, then back at her. "You can tell that just by looking. I can tell because I have lived in these mountains my whole life and I know how they breathe." She began unstacking the wood. "You can refuse the delivery if you like." He did not refuse it. He helped her stack the new load beside the old, and when they were done, he invited her inside for tea, expecting her to decline as she always had before. But this time she hesitated, glancing toward the forest and then back at him, and finally nodded. "Just for a moment," she said. "The storm is still 2 days off." Adrian's cottage was small but well built, with a stone fireplace that filled the single room with warmth, and a table by the window where he worked on his maps and correspondence. He put the kettle on while she stood near the door, looking around with the careful attention of someone assessing an unfamiliar space. When the tea was ready, he poured 2 cups and gestured to the chairs by the fire. "Sit," he said. "You have earned it after that climb." She sat, though she looked slightly uncomfortable, as if she were not used to being a guest in someone else's home. Adrian took the other chair and sipped his tea, wondering how to start a conversation that would not send her straight back out the door. "You were right about the storm last time," he said eventually. "It snowed for 3 days straight." "I am always right about the weather," she said without arrogance, just stating a fact. "It is part of knowing the forest." "Is that what you do, know the forest?" She looked at him over the rim of her cup, and he thought he saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a weighing and measuring. "Yes," she said finally, "that is what I do, and you do it alone." "Yes. Why?" He leaned forward, trying to catch her gaze. I am not trying to pry, I have lived up here for 5 years, and I have never seen another soul who spends as much time in the high country as you do. Most people stick to the valleys and the villages. So why do you stay in the forest?" She was quiet for a long time, staring into her tea as if it held answers she was reluctant to speak aloud. When she finally looked up, her expression was serious. "Because the old forest is the last of its kind in these mountains," she said. "And there are men who want to cut it down for timber and profit. Someone needs to be there to stop them." Adrian blinked. "Stop them how?" "By being there. By knowing every trail and stream and hollow. By making it clear that the forest is not empty, that it is watched and claimed and protected." She set her cup down with a soft click. "My clan used to live in those woods. We were not many, but we knew the land and we kept it safe. Then the wars came and the sickness after, and one by one we scattered or died. Now there is only me." The words settled into the warm room like stones dropped into still water, heavy and undeniable. Adrian felt something shift in his chest, a strange ache for a woman he barely knew and a loss he could not fully understand. "That is a hard thing to carry alone," he said quietly. "It is the thing I have," she replied. "So I carry it." They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them, and Adrian found himself revising every assumption he had made about the woman who delivered his firewood. He had thought her solitary by choice, perhaps shy or simply unsociable, but the truth was larger and lonelier than that. She was not just alone, she was the last, a single guardian standing watch over something precious that no one else seemed to value. "What is your name?" he asked, because it seemed suddenly absurd that he had bought wood from her for 3 years and never thought to ask. She looked surprised, as if the question had caught her off guard. "Kara," she said after a moment. "Kara Dowran, Adrian Thornhill." He offered his hand, and after a brief hesitation she took it. Her grip was strong and warm, and he found himself reluctant to let go. "Thank you for the wood, Kara, and for the warning about the storm." "You are welcome, Adrian Thornhill." She stood, pulling her cloak tighter around her shoulders. "I should go. There are others who will need deliveries before the snow comes." He walked her to the door and watched as she trudged back down the path, her sledge bouncing along behind her. The sky was still clear, but he believed her about the storm. She knew things he did not, saw patterns in the world that he had never learned to read, and there was something deeply reassuring about that. The storm came exactly when she said it would, and it buried the mountain in snow so deep that Adrian could not see past his own fence line for 4 days. He stayed inside, warm and well-fed, burning the wood she had brought and thinking about forests and clans and women who carried impossible burdens without complaint. When the storm finally broke and the world emerged white and glittering under a pale sun, he strapped on his snowshoes and made his way down the mountain toward the village, his surveyor's tools packed carefully in his rucksack. The village of Fenton's Cross sat at the junction of 2 valleys, a cluster of stone buildings and snow-covered roofs that served the scattered homesteaders and trappers who worked the high country. Adrian did not come down often, but he knew the people well enough to trade gossip and news when he did. The general store was warm and crowded, and the proprietor, a grizzled man named Harlan Fletcher, greeted him with a nod. "Thornhill. Survived the storm?" "Barely," Adrian said with a grin. "I was down to my last 100 logs," Harlan snorted. "That orc woman take care of you, did she?" "She did. Warned me it was coming too, she would know." Harlan leaned on the counter, his expression souring slightly. "Woman knows these mountains better than anyone, orc or human. Shame she wastes it living like a hermit." Adrian picked up a sack of flour, weighing it in his hands. "She said something about watching the old forest. What did she mean by that?" Harlan's face darkened. Means she is sitting on prime timber and refuses to let anyone touch it. Gregor Calloway has been trying to buy rights to that land for 2 years now, and she turns him down flat every time. Says it is protected, that her people have claim to it. But orcs do not have claims, not legal ones, and Calloway is not the type to give up easy. Adrian set the flower down carefully. Who is Gregor Calloway? Timber baron from downriver. Owns most of the sawmills in the valley and half the logging crews besides. He has got an eye for profit and no love for anyone who stands in his way. Harlan shook his head. If that orc woman is not careful, she is going to find herself in trouble she cannot handle. Adrian bought his supplies and left, but Harlan's words stuck with him as he made the long climb back to his cottage. Protected land. Legal claims. It was the kind of problem a surveyor might understand, the kind of tangle that could be solved with the right maps and the right arguments. And if there was one thing Adrian Thornhill was good at, it was untangling property disputes. He spent the next week digging through his books and notes, pulling out every reference to land grants and commons law that he had accumulated in his years of surveying. The law was a mess of overlapping claims and ancient precedents, but there were provisions for communal lands, for forests held in trust by clans or families who had lived there long enough to establish rights. If Kara's people had occupied the old forest before the region was formally settled, there might be a case for claiming it as protected commons, land that could not be sold or logged without permission from the traditional stewards. It was a long shot, but it was something, and Adrian found himself working late into the night, sketching out arguments and searching for legal precedents. He told himself it was just an interesting problem, the kind of intellectual puzzle he had always enjoyed, but he knew that was not the whole truth. The whole truth was that he could not stop thinking about a woman with amber eyes and a burden too heavy for one person to carry, and he wanted to help her in the only way he knew how. When Kara came again a month later with another delivery, he was ready. "I have a question for you," he said as they stacked the wood. "About the old forest." She glanced at him warily. "What kind of question?" "The kind that might help you keep it safe." He straightened, brushing snow from his gloves. "Come inside, I want to show you something." This time she followed without hesitation, and he spread his maps and notes across the table while she stood beside him, her expression guarded. He explained what he had found, walking her through the legal arguments and the precedents, pointing out the gaps in the local land registry, and the overlapping claims that had never been properly resolved. It was dry, technical work, but she listened with fierce attention, and when he was done, she looked at him with something that might have been hope. "You think this could work?" she asked. "I think it is worth trying," Adrian said, "but I will need your help. I will need to survey the old forest, map its boundaries, document any evidence of your clan's occupation, and I will need to file a formal claim with the land office in Ember Ridge." "Why are you doing this?" The question was blunt, almost suspicious. "You barely know me." He met her gaze and found he did not have a simple answer. "Because I am bored. Because it is the right thing to do. Because I cannot stand the thought of something precious being destroyed for profit. Because every time you leave I wish you would stay longer." He settled on the truth, or at least part of it. "Because you should not have to fight this alone," he said. "And because I have skills that can help. Let me use them." She studied him for a long moment, and he had the strange sense of being weighed on some internal scale, judged by criteria he did not fully understand. Then she nodded, a sharp, decisive movement. "All right," she said. "I will show you the forest, but you should know what you are getting into." Gregor Calloway is not a man who takes kindly to interference. "I am not particularly worried about Gregor Calloway," Adrian said, which was not entirely true, But he was committed now, and there was no point in backing out. They began the next morning, setting out before dawn with Adrian's surveying tools and enough supplies for several days in the backcountry. Kara led him along trails he had never seen, winding paths that cut through deep snow and old growth. And as they climbed higher into the mountains, he began to understand what she was protecting. The old forest was not like the timber stands in the lower valleys, where the trees grew straight and uniform. Here the pines and oaks and maples were ancient, their trunks thick as houses, their branches interlocking overhead in a canopy that filtered the winter light into shades of green and gold. The air smelled of resin and cold earth, and everywhere he looked there were signs of life. Tracks in the snow, birds flitting through the branches, the distant call of something large moving through the underbrush. "This is beautiful," he said, pausing to catch his breath on a ridge overlooking a frozen stream. "This is necessary," Kara corrected. She pointed toward the stream. "That feeds 3 rivers that run all the way to the coast. Cut down these trees and the water will run fast and dirty, flooding in spring and drying up in summer. The valleys will suffer. The fish will die. People do not see it because they do not look past their own profit." Adrian nodded slowly, his surveyor's mind already cataloging slopes and watersheds, seeing the connections she described. "How much of this did your clan control?" "All of it," she said. "From the high ridge to the southern boundary where the old stone markers still stand. 20 square miles, maybe more." It was a huge area, and Adrian felt a flicker of doubt about whether he could actually make a legal case stick. But he pushed the doubt aside and got to work, using his instruments to measure angles and distances, marking trees and landmarks on his maps, taking notes on everything Kara told him about the history of the land. She showed him the remains of old campsites, the carved stones that marked clan boundaries, the trails that had been worn into the earth by generations of feet. It was painstaking work, and they spent 3 days tramping through snow and underbrush before Adrian was satisfied that he had enough documentation to support a claim. They camped in a small clearing on the 3rd night, building a fire and sharing the dried meat and bread Kara had packed. Adrian was exhausted, his legs aching from the constant climbing, but he felt a deep satisfaction at the work they had done. Across the fire, Kara sat with her back against a fallen log, her face thoughtful in the flickering light. "You are good at this," she said. "The surveying, the maps. You have done it a long time." "Most of my adult life," Adrian admitted. "I used to work for a big land company, laying out roads and town sites. It paid well, but I got tired of destroying things in the name of progress. So you came to the mountains to be alone. Something like that." He poked at the fire with a stick, sending up a spray of sparks. "I thought I wanted solitude. Turns out I was just tired of the wrong kind of company." She smiled faintly, the firelight catching on her small tusks. "I understand that." They fell into a comfortable silence, and Adrian found himself studying her across the flames. In the daylight, she was all business, focused and efficient, but here in the quiet of the forest she seemed more at ease, as if the trees themselves gave her permission to relax. He wondered what she had been like before she became the last of her clan, whether she had been different when there were others to share the burden. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can ask. I may not answer." "Fair enough." He hesitated, then forged ahead. "Do you ever wish you were not alone?" Her expression shifted, becoming unreadable. "Every day," she said quietly, "but wishing does not change anything. This is the life I have, so I live it." "It does not have to be the only life you have," Adrian said before he could stop himself. "You could leave, find a new place, a new purpose. You do not owe the forest everything." "Yes, I do." Her voice was firm but not angry. "This forest is the last piece of my people that still exists. If I leave, if I let it be destroyed, then we are truly gone. I cannot do that. I will not." Adrian wanted to argue, to tell her that she mattered more than trees and memories, but he could see the resolve in her eyes and knew it would be pointless. So instead he said, "Then we will make sure you do not have to." She looked at him for a long moment and something in her expression softened. "Thank you, Adrian. You are welcome, Kara." They returned to the lower valleys 4 days after they had left, and Adrian spent the next 2 weeks writing up his findings and drafting a formal petition to present to the land office. He worked with the focus of a man possessed, double-checking every measurement and citation, building the strongest case he could. When it was done, he made the long journey to Ember Ridge, the regional capital, and filed the claim in person, paying the fees and securing a hearing date before the forest magistrate. The response came faster than he expected. A letter arrived 3 weeks later, delivered by a rider who looked nervous and left in a hurry. The letter was not from the land office. It was from Gregor Calloway. Adrian read it twice, his jaw tightening with each pass. The language was polite, but the message was clear. Withdraw your claim or face consequences. Calloway had learned about the petition, and he was not pleased. He hinted at legal action, at delays and expenses that would bankrupt a small-time surveyor, at difficulties Adrian might face if he persisted in meddling in matters that did not concern him. It was a threat wrapped in courtesy, and it made Adrian's blood boil. He rode out to find Kara the next morning, following the trails she had shown him, until he reached the heart of the old forest. He found her near the stone markers, repairing a section of fence that kept deer away from a young sapling grove. She looked up as he approached, and her expression grew serious when she saw his face. "What happened?" He handed her the letter. She read it slowly, her lips moving slightly as she worked through the formal phrasing, and when she finished her hands were shaking. "He knows," she said. "He knows, and he is trying to scare us off." Adrian took the letter back and folded it carefully. "But it is just bluster. He cannot do anything unless we back down. You do not know him." Kara's voice was tight. "He has got money and men and no conscience. If he wants this land badly enough, he will find a way to take it. Not if we move fast." Adrian pulled out his notes. "The hearing is in 6 weeks. If we can present a strong enough case, the magistrate will have to recognize your claim. Once it is official, Calloway will have to go through courts to challenge it, and that takes time. We just need to hold out long enough to get the protection in place." Kara looked at him, her amber eyes searching his face. "You are not afraid of him." "I am terrified of him," Adrian admitted. "But I am more afraid of what happens if we do nothing." She laughed, a short, startled sound, and some of the tension left her shoulders. "You are a strange man, Adrian Thornhill. I have been called worse." He grinned, trying to lighten the mood. "Come on, let's get back to work. We have got a case to prepare." They spent the next month gathering more evidence, tracking down old records and interviewing trappers who remembered Kara's clan, building a web of testimony and documentation that supported her claim. It was exhausting work, and more than once Adrian wondered if he was in over his head, but Kara never faltered. She moved through the forest with quiet determination, showing him every hidden corner and forgotten trail, and he found himself falling into a rhythm with her, learning to anticipate her movements and match her pace. They talked as they worked, trading stories and opinions, and Adrian discovered that, beneath her serious exterior, Kara had a dry sense of humor and a sharp mind. She asked him about his life before the mountains, and he found himself telling her things he had not spoken of in years. The boredom and frustration of working for the land company, the slow realization that he was complicit in something he did not believe in, the relief he had felt when he finally walked away. She listened without judgment, and when he was done, she told him about her childhood in the forest, about learning the names of plants and the habits of animals, about the stories her grandmother had told around the fire on cold winter nights. It was easy, talking to her. Easier than it had been with anyone in a long time, and Adrian found himself looking forward to their days together, to the sound of her voice and the way she smiled when he made a joke. He told himself it was just camaraderie, the natural bond that formed between people working toward a common goal, but he knew he was lying. He was falling in love with her, slowly and inevitably, the way snow accumulated in the high country, one flake at a time until the world was buried in white. The night before they were to leave for the hearing in Ember Ridge, they camped again in the old forest, building a fire in the same clearing they had used before. The sky was clear and cold, the stars sharp overhead, and the forest around them was quiet except for the occasional crack of a branch settling under the weight of snow. Kara sat across from him, staring into the flames, and Adrian watched her and tried to find the courage to say what he was thinking. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Kara," she looked up. "Yes, if this works, if we win the hearing and the forest is protected, what will you do?" She frowned as if the question had never occurred to her. "I will keep watching it. That is my job. But you will not be alone anymore," Adrian said carefully. "There will be legal protections, official recognition. You will not have to carry it all by yourself." "I suppose not." She tilted her head. "Why do you ask?" He took a breath, his heart hammering in his chest. "Because I was thinking that maybe I could help. Not just with the legal work, but with the watching. The forest is too big for one person, and I've got surveying skills, map-making skills. I could document changes, keep records. We could work together." "You want to live in the forest?" She sounded surprised. "I want to live near it," he clarified. "Or in it, if you would have me." "My cottage is too far away to be useful, but if there was a place closer, a warden's cabin or something, I could." He trailed off, suddenly unsure. "I am saying this badly. What I mean is, I do not want to go back to being alone. I like working with you. I like talking to you. And if there is a chance that you might feel the same, then I would like to stay." The silence that followed felt like an eternity. Kara stared at him, her expression unreadable, and Adrian braced himself for rejection, for the awkwardness that would follow his clumsy confession. But then she smiled, a real smile that lit up her whole face, and his heart did a complicated flip in his chest. "I would like that," she said softly. "I would like that very much." They left for Ember Ridge the next morning, and the hearing 3 days later was a tense formal affair held in a wood-paneled room that smelled of old paper and candle wax. The forest magistrate was a stern older woman with sharp eyes and no patience for nonsense, and Gregor Calloway's lawyer was a slick professional who tried every trick in the book to dismiss the claim. But Adrian had done his homework, and Kara's testimony was clear and compelling, and when the magistrate finally rendered her decision, she ruled in their favor. The old forest was to be recognized as protected commons, held in trust by Kara Dowran and her heirs, with logging and development prohibited without consent from the designated warden. Gregor Calloway, who had attended the hearing in person, looked furious. He was a big man with cold eyes and a mouth like a steel trap, and as they left the building he stepped into their path, his lawyer hovering at his shoulder. "You think this is over?" he said quietly. "You think a piece of paper will stop me?" "I think the law will stop you," Adrian replied, keeping his voice calm. "Unless you want to explain to the magistrate why you are ignoring her ruling." Calloway's eyes narrowed. "Watch yourself, surveyor. Accidents happen in the mountains. Fires start, people get lost. Adrian felt Kara stiffen beside him, but before either of them could respond, a new voice cut in. "Is that a threat, Mr. Calloway?" They turned to see the forest magistrate standing in the doorway, her expression glacial. Calloway paled slightly, then forced a smile. "Just a friendly warning, Your Honor. The high country is dangerous." "So is threatening witnesses in front of a magistrate," she replied. "I will be including this conversation in my official report. Good day, Mr. Calloway." She swept past them, leaving Calloway standing in the street, his face red with anger. He glared at Adrian and Kara for a long moment, then turned and stalked away, his lawyer scurrying after him. "That was unpleasant," Adrian muttered. "That was a promise," Kara said grimly. "He is not done." She was right. They returned to the forest and settled into a wary watchfulness, and for a few weeks everything seemed fine. Adrian moved his belongings to a small cabin near the heart of the old forest, a sturdy structure that had once housed Kara's uncle, and now served as the official warden's post. It was strange at first, living so close to another person after years of solitude, but the strangeness faded quickly into something comfortable. They fell into an easy routine, sharing meals and chores, spending their days patrolling the forest and their evenings by the fire, talking about everything and nothing. Adrian had never been happier. Then the fire started. It was early spring, the snow just beginning to melt, when they smelled smoke on the wind. They ran toward it, following the acrid scent through the trees, and found a section of the southern boundary burning, flames licking up the trunks of old pines and spreading through the underbrush. They fought it for hours, hauling water from the stream and beating back the flames with wet blankets, and by the time they had it under control, they were both exhausted and filthy, their hands blistered and their lungs raw from smoke. Adrian stood in the charred clearing, staring at the blackened earth, and felt a cold fury settle in his chest. This was not an accident. "No," Kara agreed. She crouched down and picked up a piece of charred wood, sniffing it. "Lamp oil. Someone set this deliberately." They reported the fire to the land office and the magistrate, and an investigation was launched. 2 weeks later, a logging foreman who worked for Calloway's company was arrested, caught trying to set another fire on the northern edge of the forest. He confessed under questioning, admitting that Calloway had paid him to burn out sections of the old forest, hoping to devalue the land and force Kara to abandon her claim. The magistrate was not amused. Calloway was hauled before the forest warden's court, a special tribunal that handled crimes against protected lands, and the evidence against him was damning. He tried to shift blame, to claim he had known nothing about the fires, but his foreman testified against him, and the court found him guilty of conspiracy and destruction of commons property. He was fined heavily, stripped of his logging rights in the region, and barred from owning or operating timber businesses in the mountain territories. It was a complete and total victory, and Adrian felt a fierce satisfaction watching Calloway storm out of the courtroom, his empire crumbling around him. "It is over," he said to Kara as they walked back through the forest afterward. "He is finished." "For now," she said, but she was smiling. "Thank you, Adrian. I could not have done this without you." "You could have," he replied, "but I am glad you did not have to." They reached the warden's cabin as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and Kara stopped on the porch, turning to look at him. "I meant what I said before," she told him. "I am glad you stayed. I am glad you are here." "So am I," Adrian said and kissed her. She kissed him back, fierce and warm, and when they finally broke apart she was grinning. "I was wondering when you would do that." "I have been wanting to for months," he admitted, "but it never seemed like the right time." "This is the right time," she said, and pulled him inside. Spring turned to summer, and the old forest bloomed with life. Adrian and Kara worked together as wardens, patrolling the boundaries and documenting the recovery of the burned sections, watching as new saplings pushed up through the ash. They built a garden near the cabin, planting vegetables and herbs, and in the evenings they sat on the porch and talked about the future. In the autumn, when the leaves turned gold and red, and the air smelled of wood smoke and ripe apples, Adrian asked Kara to marry him. They were standing on the high ridge overlooking the forest, the same place where he had first understood what she was protecting. And when she said yes, he felt as if the world had shifted into perfect alignment. They were married at first thaw, a simple ceremony held in the clearing where they had camped so many times, with a traveling priest officiating, and a handful of trappers and homesteaders bearing witness. Kara wore a dress of green wool that matched her skin, and Adrian wore his best shirt and a coat his mother had made him years ago. And when they exchanged vows under the branches of the old trees, he felt a joy so complete, it was almost painful. Life in the forest was not easy, but it was good. They worked hard and laughed often, and in the evenings they lay together by the fire, trading stories and making plans. 2 years after the wedding, Kara gave birth to a daughter with her mother's amber eyes and her father's quick smile, and they named her Rowan, after the tree that grew beside the cabin door. Adrian taught Rowan to read and write, to use a compass and draw maps, and Kara taught her the names of every tree and plant in the forest, the habits of the animals, the way to read the weather in the movement of clouds. By the time she was 5, she could navigate the trails as well as either of her parents, and by the time she was 7, she was helping with the warden's work, marking boundaries and checking for signs of poachers. One evening when Rowan was 8, they sat together on the porch watching the sunset, and she turned to Adrian with a serious expression. "Papa, why did you come to live in the forest?" Adrian glanced at Kara, who was smiling, and then back at his daughter. "Because your mother needed help," he said, "and because I wanted to be somewhere that mattered." "Does it matter?" Rowan asked. "The forest." "It matters more than almost anything," Kara said quietly. "This forest is older than any of us, older than the villages and the roads. It has seen the world change and it has survived. We are just here to make sure it survives a little longer." Rowan nodded, satisfied, and went back to watching the sky. Adrian reached over and took Kara's hand, lacing their fingers together, and felt the same deep contentment he had felt on their wedding day. The old forest stood around them, strong and ancient, and somewhere in the distance, a nightingale sang. Years passed, measured in seasons and small milestones. Rowan grew tall and quick-witted, inheriting her mother's love of the forest and her father's gift for careful observation. Adrian's hair started to gray at the temples, and Kara's hands grew even more scarred from years of work. But they moved through the forest together with the ease of people who had shared a life for so long. They could anticipate each other's thoughts. The old forest thrived under their care, spreading slowly outward as saplings took root in clearings and streams ran clear and cold. Other wardens were appointed to help manage the commons, younger men and women who looked to Adrian and Kara for guidance. And gradually, a network of protection grew across the mountains, linking the old forest to other wild places that had been saved from logging and development. Gregor Calloway disappeared from the region, his business ruined and his reputation destroyed, and no one mourned his absence. The villages and homesteads prospered, drawing clean water from the rivers that flowed out of the protected forest, and slowly the story of the orc woman who had stood against the timber baron became legend, told around fires and in taverns as an example of what one person could do if they refused to give up. But Adrian and Kara did not think of themselves as legends. They were simply two people who had found each other in the cold heart of winter and chosen to build a life together, and that was enough. One spring evening, when Rowan was 15 and already talking about becoming a warden herself, Adrian and Kara walked together to the high ridge where he had proposed so many years before. The sun was setting behind the mountains, and the forest stretched out below them in shades of green and gold, vast and beautiful and alive. "You ever miss it?" Kara asked, leaning against his shoulder. "Your old life before you came to the mountains?" Adrian thought about it, remembering the noise and the crowds, the endless surveying jobs that had taken him nowhere he wanted to go. "No," he said honestly. "I do not miss it at all. This is where I was supposed to be." "I am glad you asked," she said softly. "That first winter when you asked why I lived alone, I am glad you cared enough to ask." "I am glad you answered," Adrian replied, "and I am glad you let me help." They stood there as the light faded, watching the forest settle into evening, and Adrian thought about all the choices that had brought them to this moment. The decision to leave his old life, the long winters of solitude, the day he had finally worked up the nerve to ask a simple question. Every step had led him here, to this ridge and this woman and this life, and he would not change a single one. Below them, the warden's cabin glowed with lamplight, and they could see Rowan moving around inside, probably reading one of the books Adrian had brought up from the village. The sight filled him with a quiet pride, knowing that their daughter would carry on the work they had started, that the forest would be safe for another generation. "We did it," Kara said, as if reading his thoughts. "We actually did it." "We did," Adrian agreed and kissed the top of her head. "Come on, let's go home." They walked down the trail together as the stars came out overhead, and the old forest whispered around them, alive and eternal. The cabin was warm when they stepped inside, and Rowan looked up from her book with a smile, and for a moment everything was perfect. This was the life Adrian Thornhill had never known he wanted. A wife he loved, a daughter he was proud of, work that mattered and land worth protecting. It was not the solitude he had come to the mountains seeking, but it was better, richer, more real than anything he had imagined. And when he lay down that night with Kara beside him, listening to the wind in the trees and the sound of Rowan's soft breathing from the other room, he felt a gratitude so deep it was almost overwhelming. He had asked a simple question one winter day, and it had changed everything. The years continued to roll forward, each one adding new layers to the life they had built. Rowan apprenticed officially as a forest warden at 16, working alongside her parents and learning the intricacies of land management and conservation law. She had Adrian's sharp mind for detail and Kara's instinctive understanding of the natural world, and it became clear early on that she would be an exceptional warden in her own right. When Rowan was 19, she met a young man named Thomas Gray, a mapmaker's son from one of the valley villages who had come to the forest to document the watershed system. He was thoughtful and earnest, with none of the prejudice that still lingered in some corners of the region, and when he looked at Rowan, it was with obvious admiration and affection. Adrian approved immediately, recognizing in the young man some echo of his own younger self, and Kara welcomed him into their home with her typical directness. "You are good for her," she told Thomas one evening as they all sat around the dinner table. "You make her laugh. That is important." Thomas flushed with pleasure. "She makes me want to be better," he admitted. "Smarter, more careful. She sees things I would never notice on my own." "That is the forest teaching her," Kara said. "If you stay with her, it will teach you too." Thomas did stay, and 2 years later he and Rowan were married in the same clearing where Adrian and Kara had exchanged their vows. It was a larger ceremony this time, with friends and colleagues from across the mountain territories gathering to celebrate, and Adrian watched his daughter dance with her new husband and felt a bittersweet pride. Time moved so fast, turning moments into memories, children into adults with lives of their own. But Rowan and Thomas did not move away. They built a small house on the western edge of the old forest, close enough to visit easily, and Thomas took up work as a surveyor and mapmaker, documenting the growing network of protected lands. Rowan continued her work as a warden, and together they helped expand the conservation efforts, bringing more forests and watersheds under protection. Adrian and Kara grew older, their movements a little slower but their minds still sharp, and they settled into the comfortable rhythm of grandparents who were content to offer advice when asked but knew better than to interfere. They spent their days tending the garden and maintaining the trails, and in the evenings they sat on the porch and watched the forest they had saved together. When Rowan gave birth to her first child, a sturdy boy with green-tinted skin and bright, curious eyes, Kara wept with joy. They named him Alder, after the trees that grew along the streams, and when Kara held him for the first time she looked at Adrian with an expression of such profound happiness that he felt his own eyes sting with tears. "He will know this forest," Kara said softly. "He will grow up here, safe and free. That is what we fought for." "That is what you fought for," Adrian corrected gently. "I just helped." "You did more than help," Kara said. "You saved me, Adrian. You saved me from being alone." He kissed her then, soft and lingering, and little Alder made a small, contented sound between them. And the moment crystallized into something Adrian knew he would remember until his last breath. 3 years later, Rowan had a daughter, a bright-eyed girl named Wren, and the warden's cabin rang with laughter and noise when the grandchildren came to visit. Adrian taught Alder to read and showed him how to use a compass, and Kara took Wren on long walks through the forest, teaching her the names of plants and the songs of birds. It was a good life, full and rich, and Adrian found himself thinking less and less about the years he had spent alone and more about all the years still to come. But time, as always, continued its steady march. Adrian's hair went fully white, and his joints began to ache on cold mornings, and Kara moved a little more carefully than she once had, favoring an old injury that had never quite healed. They were not old, not yet, but they were aging, and they both knew it. One afternoon in late autumn, when the leaves were falling and the air smelled of wood smoke and approaching winter, they walked together to the high ridge one last time. It was a long climb, harder than it had been 20 years ago, but they took their time and reached the summit just as the sun was setting. The forest spread out below them, vast and beautiful, and Adrian felt a deep sense of completion looking at it. This was their legacy, this wild living thing that would outlast them both, protected by the laws they had fought for and the family they had raised. "No regrets?" Kara asked, echoing a question he had asked her so many years ago. "Not a single one," Adrian replied, and meant it with every fiber of his being. "You? Only that I did not ask you to stay sooner," she said, smiling. "I wasted too many years being stubborn." "You were not stubborn," Adrian said. "You were strong, and you let me in when it mattered." They stood there until the sun disappeared behind the mountains, and then they walked back down to the cabin together, their hands clasped, their steps synchronized from decades of walking side by side. The winters that followed were gentle by mountain standards, and Adrian and Kara spent them warm and comfortable in the warden's cabin, watching the snow fall and telling stories to their grandchildren when they visited. Alder and Wren grew quickly, bright and curious, and it became clear that they too would carry on the family tradition of forest wardenship. Adrian's health held steady until his 70th winter, when a cold settled deep in his chest and would not leave. Kara nursed him through it with fierce determination, brewing teas and keeping the fire high, refusing to even consider the possibility that he might not recover. And eventually, slowly, he did, though he was weaker afterward, more easily tired. "You scared me," Kara told him one evening as they sat by the fire, her hand tight around his. "I scared myself," Adrian admitted, "but I am not ready to go yet. There is still too much to see." "Good," Kara said firmly, "because I am not ready to let you go either." They had 5 more years together after that. 5 more seasons of watching the forest change and grow, of seeing their grandchildren flourish, of quiet mornings and peaceful evenings. They celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary surrounded by family and friends, and Adrian looked around the crowded cabin and felt a satisfaction deeper than words. He had come to the mountains seeking solitude and found instead a purpose, a family, a love that had defined the second half of his life. The orc woman who had delivered firewood every winter had become the center of his world, and he would not trade a single moment of the life they had built together. On a clear spring morning in his 76th year, Adrian woke to find Kara already up, standing on the porch and looking out at the forest. He joined her, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders, and they stood together in the cool dawn air. "I have been thinking," Kara said quietly, "about everything we have done, everything we have built, and," Adrian prompted. "And I think we did well," she said, leaning into him. "I think we made a difference." "We did," Adrian agreed. "We absolutely did." They stood there until the sun cleared the mountains, flooding the valley with golden light, and then they went inside to make breakfast and start another day. There would be many more days after that, days of work and laughter and small, quiet joys, and Adrian intended to treasure every one of them. Because he had learned something important in his years with Kara, something that had taken him far too long to understand. Love was not about grand gestures or dramatic moments. It was about showing up, day after day, season after season, and choosing to build something together. It was about asking the right questions and being brave enough to answer them honestly. It was about finding someone who saw the world the same way you did and deciding that you would face it together, no matter what came. Adrian Thornhill had asked a simple question one winter day, and Kara Dowran had answered him honestly, and everything that followed had been the natural consequence of that single moment of courage. They had saved a forest, raised a family, and built a life that mattered. And if that was not a happy ending, Adrian did not know what was. The old forest stood around them, patient and eternal, and somewhere in its depths, a new generation of wardens walked the trails, learning the names of trees and the patterns of weather, carrying on the work that Adrian and Kara had started. The firewood was always stacked high against the cabin wall, and the fire burned warm through every winter, and when spring came the world burst into bloom again, fresh and new and full of promise. That was the cycle, the rhythm of life in the mountains, and Adrian and Kara moved through it together, hand in hand, for all the years they were given. And when people told the story of the orc woman who had protected the old forest, they always mentioned the human surveyor who had loved her, and the family they had raised, and the legacy they had left behind. It was a good story, and it was true, and that was all that mattered in the end.